Welcome to Contracts Plus training. In this class, we will be discussing the Contract Risk Analysis add-on for Contracts Plus. These are the essential questions that we will answer during this class. How can my organization benefit from this feature? How do end users perform risk analysis on contracts? And what is entailed in the setup of these risk configurations? In order to answer those questions, these are the objectives that we have. We will understand the value and purpose of the Contract Risk Analysis module, learn how to run a risk report on a contract using an active configuration, and then we will set up, activate, and manage a new risk configuration. Our first lesson is called Contract Risk Analysis Overview. In this lesson, we will discuss the background of this add-on module. What is it? Why is it beneficial? Then we will cover some key terms that will help your overall understanding of the risk analysis feature. And then I will provide a demonstration of how the contract risk analysis works once it's configured and active. That way you can see what it looks like from an end user point of view. This will set the stage for the rest of our class, wherein we will learn all that goes into setting up risk configurations. Let's begin with a bit of background about contract risk analysis. It's an add-on module for Contracts Plus that analyzes terms and conditions, leveraging artificial intelligence. This solution allows your organization to uncover potential risks and limit that risk exposure, increase compliance, and save time. It also limits your reliance on your legal personnel, as it can quickly analyze third-party paper or contracts drafted outside your organization, such as in the case of mergers and acquisitions, for example. We provide an out-of-the-box analysis configuration for both MSAs and SOWs. This includes some standard language with default risk severity levels associated to them. These configurations are completely customizable by administrators. They can serve as a starting point, and you can modify them to include your standard language and associate a risk severity level if the language in the contract being analyzed differs from it. The results of the analysis generates a contract risk score in a viewable report that may also be downloaded too. Now let's discuss some terminology associated with the risk analysis module. First, we have intent. This is a legal or contractual clause that can be found in one or more paragraphs in a document. Some examples might include confidentiality, law and jurisdiction, dispute resolutions. Basically, intents are what we think of as clauses. The main focus of the risk identification for an intent is to identify any variations in the content. The information in the document you're analyzing can be compared with the standard clause to evaluate any deviation in language. And if any deviation is found, the clause will be marked as risky and assigned with the risk score that was indicated in the risk score configuration, and more on this later. Next, we have entity. An entity is some distinguishable information within an intent that adds meaning to clauses, such as names, locations, addresses, dates, things like that. Entities, which are extracted from an intent, can be evaluated for risk based on entity-specific risk configuration. Again, we're going to discuss this in detail in an upcoming lesson. Next, we have risk score, which is the overall level of detected risk in the document that you are analyzing. These can be defined for each risk configuration type, so MSAs and SOWs, and they can also be defined differently in each specific configuration. So the way that it works is that when an intent or an entity is flagged as risky, it will add to the risk score of the overall document that's based on the risk score configuration. And finally, we have standard clause. This is a section or portion of a clause against which the other contract clause is to be compared. And this is what you, the administrator, can define. Now that we've seen some high-level information about contract risk analysis, I want to take a few moments and give you a demonstration of the power this feature has once it's configured. I'm going to show you an example where I run a contract analysis using an already active risk configuration. We're going to learn how I configured that risk configuration later. Right now, I just want to show how this feature is used from an end user perspective. So we will run the risk report, view any identified intent or entity risks, and then learn how to download the report and view it in Excel. So let's jump into Contracts Plus and have a look. At my organization, we have entered into an agreement for catering services. The third party has sent me their MSA. Our risk configuration has been created and activated, and we'll talk more on how to do this later. For now, let's just see how it works. So I'm viewing this contract, which has the main document uploaded already, and let's run an analysis so that the legal team can review it and get to work. From the Actions drop-down on the main document attachment, I can select Analyze Contract. Now it's going out to Jagger's technology partner. It's analyzing it. It'll be extracting data, performing an OCR if necessary, and it just takes a couple of moments for the report to be returned. So now the process is complete, and we can see the results here. So the document level risk score is 31.5. There are aspects of this contract that have flagged 12 high risk points, 4 medium risk points, and 1 low risk point. To view more details about the report, we can click this little eye icon. So let's see what we have. So there are some key terms to be aware of here in terms of how to read this report. The intent is what we would think of as a clause, and the type, it falls into sort of a category. Then we have 2 columns of text here. We have master, which is the customer-defined standard clause language. So this is what our organization said we would like to see as the standard language for this clause. And then document is what is in this actual document that we analyzed. Now, in this case, these first couple of clauses are blank in the document column because those clauses have not been found in this document. And so that in itself is triggering the risk. You can see here I have an example of one where we can view the 2 side by side, and it highlights any differences in the language. Now on the far right, we have a risk designated in red for high risk, orange for medium risk, or green for low risk. And that's been determined by our administrator as well. So risk can be analyzed at the intent level, as we see here. And this is just a word-by-word comparison. So if there is any variance in language, it's going to trigger the configured risk level to appear here in red, orange, or green. It's also worth noting at this point that if the language in the master and the document you're analyzing are identical, then it will not be returned in this report because it will be deemed not risky. So just be aware of that. Now, even more beneficial than analyzing risk at the overall intent level is at the entity level, and entities are like keywords or fields. And let me show you an example of that. We have our payment terms intent, and because the language is different in our document as compared to our standard language, this has been flagged as high risk. We can click on the intent to view more details about it. And below, we'll see any entities that have been triggered for risk. So in this example, the payment term is less than 90 days. It's actually 45 days in the document we're analyzing. And because of that, it's been triggered for risk. And in this case, it was marked as low risk. The interest entity, the way this rule is written is that if the interest is not equal to 1, then it should be flagged as high risk. And in our case, it's 2. So that's why it's been marked as high risk. You can also download this report and view everything at once in Excel. So here, if we're viewing it in Excel, it's a similar layout. It's just all on one page and might be a little bit easier to read. You could also save this, send it around, have your legal team take a look at it, or do whatever you need to do with it. This lesson is called Creating a Risk Configuration. We will discuss the requirements for managing risk configurations. We will talk about how to create a new risk configuration, which includes defining the risk scores, configuring intents, entities, and setting entity rules. In terms of requirements, you need to have the contract risk management license turned on in your organization in order to activate this feature. Contact Jagger if you are interested in obtaining this module. Then, to manage risk configurations, users are going to need to have the contract configuration permission. If you've met those requirements, then you'll be able to create a new risk configuration by navigating to Contracts, General Contract Settings, and the Risk Management tab. Here, you will see a list of your existing risk configurations as you accumulate them. You can create a new one by selecting the Create Risk Configuration button, and then choose a configuration type. That is this going to be for MSAs or SOWs? Creating a new one will generate the out-of-box configuration. So whatever configuration type you choose, MSA or SOW, will determine what intents and entities are included. Once the risk configuration is created, you can define the risk scores. so you have full control over the scoring aspect of the risk analysis. Just a little bit of information about the scoring. Risk can be set at both the intent and entity level, and when risk is identified, the score is assigned based on the configured value. And you can determine that configured value. So at the top of the configuration, there's an area called Risk Score Configuration. Here, you can assign a score between 0 and 1 for each severity level, high, medium, and low. When the report is generated for a contract, the sum of the individual risk scores will be aggregated for an overall document-level risk score. You may recall seeing those scores in our demonstration in the last lesson. Let's take a look at how to create a new risk configuration in Contracts Plus. In this demonstration, I'm going to create a new risk configuration for master service agreements. This will generate an out-of-the-box model for me to customize, and I'll just get started in this process by creating a new one and defining the risk score configuration, and then we'll talk about the intents and entities later. I'm logged into our organization, and I'm now playing the role of an administrator. I do have the contract configuration permission, so I'll go over to Contracts, Contract Administration, General Contract Settings. Now, since my organization has that license enabled, I see this Risk Management tab. Let's take a look. And you can see here that we have a few existing configurations already. They're organized by the type, either MSA or SOW. Here's the configuration name. We have a column for the active version, if there is one, and also the option to either create a draft if there's not one, or view an existing draft. These also can be associated with contract types and given a description, though that hasn't been done in our case just yet. So I want to show you how to create a new risk configuration. We'll get started by clicking the Create Risk Configuration. We have to give it a name. Maybe let's say that we need a new MSA configuration for 2021. I can choose to give this a description if I'd like. And then we choose our risk configuration type. For right now, the options are MSA or SOW, but I'll stick with MSA for this example and click Create. Now remember that choosing the configuration type determines which intents and entities come out of the box. So now we are viewing the draft risk configuration, and this is our out-of-box model. At the top here, you can see the risk score configuration area, and this is where we can define the scores that are associated with each of these levels of risk. The defaults out of the box are high is 1, medium is 0.5, and low is 0. I can customize or change these, though they do have to be a value between 0 and 1, and they should be scored with high being the highest value. And I'm actually just going to leave mine alone in this demonstration, but just notice that these are editable fields if you would like to change them for any of your risk configurations. We're going to talk more about these categories that we can expand here. I just wanted to get the process started in this demonstration. So for right now, let's just save our changes. We can save our configuration at any time by clicking the Save button. And now let's go back into the presentation to find out more about how to customize this out-of-the-box model. Now let's revisit those key terms we discussed in our last lesson, only here I'm going to give you some visual context on where they appear in the solution. So below the risk score configuration section where we left off is a series of sections, what we call categories, that cover different contract areas that users may want to include in a risk analysis. The available categories will differ based on whether your risk configuration applies to MSAs or SOWs. Now, each of the sections or categories covers different areas of a contract, but the functionality is identical. So in this screenshot, I'm just showing one example, and it happens to be of the commercial category. So when you expand the category, you'll see a list of intents you may wish to use in your risk configuration. In this screenshot, advertising, compensation, and payment terms are all examples of intents that fall within the commercial category. Each of these intents may be further expanded by clicking on the arrow next to their names. So in this screenshot, the expanded example we're working with here is payment terms. But again, you can see that advertising and compensation are also intents that fall under the commercial category, they just aren't expanded. In the text box under the intent, you can enter the text that the contract risk analysis is to seek in the contracts. This text is what we call the standard clause. So this is your standard clause language that you want to compare contract documents to. Below the intent is the entities section. Each entity is enabled or disabled using the checkbox, just like the intent. And entities are where you can define specific aspects of the intent wording and assign an additional risk value if there's a deviation from specific conditions that you set. So hopefully this slide helps provide a bit of context to the terminology that we learned in our last lesson. One other thing to point out in this screenshot is that risk values can be assigned at both the intent level and the entity level using the corresponding drop-down menus. For right now, let's narrow this down a little bit and just focus on one aspect of the risk configuration. I want to talk about how to configure intents first. So remember, in this example, the intent that we're looking at happens to be the payment terms intent. So to edit an intent, you can expand it if it's not already expanded. And if you want to use this intent in your risk configuration, select the Enabled checkbox. Then, as I mentioned, you can enter your standard clause language in the text box. So this should reflect the exact wording of the corresponding clause in your organization's contracts. Maybe you're even copying and pasting what's in the clause library if you're making use of the clause library. When the report is run, it's going to flag or trigger risk if there's any deviation in language between the actual contract and this standard clause. If the standard clause is not found in the analyzed contract, then it's also recorded as a risk. And we saw this in our initial demonstration on our contract. Let's go back into Contracts Plus and enable some intents and customize some standard language. So we're going to take a look at the categories that are found in our MSA configuration, enable some intents, customize some of the standard language that's coming out of the box, and then determine a risk severity level that should be assigned if the analyzed document clause language is not an exact match to this standard language. So back on this risk configuration that we created before, you can see that we can expand these categories to view the intents that are within them. We'll start just with business just to see what we have here. Each of these listed here, this next level, contract recital, damages, notices, term, and validity, these are all intents. And out of the box, they are all enabled, meaning that they're all going to be included in the risk analysis. You can expand an intent further to either enable or disable it. And then the intent may also have entities below it. And we'll talk more about entities in a couple of minutes. First, let's just talk about enabling intents. So if you don't want to include an intent, you can just deselect the enabled box. When you save, this green check will become a red X, and we'll see that in a few moments. In my risk analysis, I do want to enable contract recital, so we want to make sure to see that blue check mark there. And this language is coming from the out-of-box model for MSAs. So I could edit this text if there's just a few words that I want to change to make it match our organization's standard language. Another thing that you can do, if you already have approved clauses by your legal department, or maybe you have approved clause language in your clause library, is you can just copy and paste that into this text box here. So let's just say that I'm going to borrow our standard clause language and just paste it right here. Then I need to decide if any change or variance in this language should be flagged as high, medium, or low risk. And I can do that from the drop-down next to the intent. I'll say high risk, and what that means is once we save this and make this configuration active, if we are analyzing a contract and there's any deviance in language at all, it's going to mark this as high risk, and we're going to see that little red square appear in our risk report. Let's take a look at some of the other intents that we have here. I can collapse this back up. Maybe we don't need to include damages, so I can just disable that. I'll expand the commercial category. Let's take a look at payment terms. And I'm going to copy and paste our standard clause language here. Let's be sure to determine our actual level of risk here. So if there's any variance in the language of payment terms, we'll just say medium risk. I'm going to deselect a couple more intents. Let's go down to dispute resolution in the legal category. Going to enter our standard language here. And same with our force majeure. Maybe we'll just say low. And then I'm going to just disable a few more intents here. So we don't need to include those in our risk report. So you can see that you can include as many or as few intents as you'd like. And if maybe you're just starting out, maybe you just want to make sure to analyze a few of the most important intents. But then as you get more comfortable with this, you can get pretty granular with the amount of risk analysis that you want to include in those risk reports. Let's just save our changes for now. Our changes were saved, and I just want to point out that if we disable any intents, we now see them with the red X. And now let's go back into the presentation and talk about how to configure the entities that are associated with these intents. Remember that each intent may have one or more entities associated with it. If the intent is enabled, then you can also enable any desired entities and assign them a risk score too. If an entity is enabled, you must specify the exact condition for it. The condition determines the circumstances under which an entity is recorded as a risk. So in the text box under the entity, you can enter the condition, and we will call these entity rules. You can see a couple of examples of entities within the payment terms intent. This screenshot shows an interest entity enabled with one condition marked as high risk. Then it also contains a payment term entity with a condition or rule marked as medium risk. So these entities are very powerful as they are where you can be really specific in outlining criteria and determining risk levels associated with them. Let's spend a few minutes discussing how to set entity rules. When you're setting entity rules, there are 4 types of rules that can be used: text actual, text calculated, number, and date. For all of these types, you will provide a reference entity value, which will be compared against any actual extracted entity value. The main differences among these rule types is just what that reference entity value is. So let's take a closer look and see a few examples of each of these types. For text actual, the reference value will be an alphanumeric set of letters, numbers, and/or special characters extracted from the intent. So this is going to check the entity for the presence or absence of a specific phrase, and it's based on a positive or negative condition. Comparison operators for writing this rule are the equal sign, which of course means equal to, and exclamation point equal sign, which means not equal to. So acceptable reference values here would be letters between A through Z, both lowercase and uppercase, numbers, and some special characters as well. The reference value should be placed between single quotes when you're writing the entity rule, and you need to surround the entire condition with parentheses. And this is true for all of our rule types. Here are some examples of entity rules written for text actual. Maybe the force majeure clause does include the word pandemic, or if the currency mode does not equal dollar. And we'll see more of exactly how to write these when we're in the solution in a couple of moments. Just notice the entire entity rule is placed between parentheses. We have the name of the entity at the beginning, followed by either an equal sign or an exclamation point equal sign. And then the reference value is in single quotes. Calculated text is an entity whose reference value will be yes or no. So risk in this case is based on simply the presence or absence of text within an intent. Either that word or phrase is included or it's not. Comparison operators are equal sign and exclamation point equal sign, just like we saw with text actual, but this is a little different because it's doing work behind the scenes. You write these rules as the entity equals or the entity does not equal. Behind the scenes, the system has been trained to look for specific language that might be related to that entity. So this is where the power of the machine learning is really in play. You don't have to tell the system what words to look for. You can just say, essentially, if you find some language related to this entity, that should be flagged as a risk. So when the analysis is done, if the system does find something, then it will be marked as risky, and if not, then it won't. Notice that you cannot write the rules as equal to no. It has to be either yes or not equal to yes. Be sure to surround the condition with parentheses and place the reference value between single quotes, just like we saw for our previous rule type too. Let's talk about a couple of examples of text calculated. You could use this within an indemnification intent if you wanted to check for the responsibility entity. The responsibility entity can be trained to look for the phrase remedy by provider and indicate risk if that phrase is found. So you'd write the reference value as responsibility equals yes. Behind the scenes, the system is smart enough to identify that phrase, so if any language associated with this entity is found, then the calculated actual value returned will be yes if that phrase is found. Another example, within the law and jurisdiction intent, you could configure the law entity to be trained to look for the keyword dispute. Then you could write the reference value as law does not equal yes. And what that would mean is that if the keyword dispute is found in the intent, you'd get an actual value of yes. If the keyword dispute is not found in the intent, you'd get an actual value of no. But because of the way that the rule was written, we said that it's risky if it does not equal yes. So if the word dispute is not found in the document, it would be marked as risky. The number type entity rules include a reference value that is a decimal or integer number that will be compared against the actual extracted entity value. For this type of rule, negative numbers, letters, and special characters are not valid. They have to be whole or decimal numbers. The comparison operators that can be used are equals, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, or does not equal. So the entire condition needs to be in parentheses and the reference value needs to be in single quotes. Here are a couple of examples. Maybe the insurance amount needs to be less than $100,000. Premium amount must be greater than 1,500. Maybe days has to be less than 30. And whether or not you include commas doesn't really matter. For date, the reference value will be a properly formatted date to compare against the extracted entity value. Comparison operators are the same ones that we saw before. It either equals, it's greater than, in this case that means after or following, less than, which would indicate before a certain date, and then of course we have greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, or does not equal. And like the other rule types, just be sure to write the reference value in single quotes and surround the whole condition with parentheses. Here are a couple of examples. So if the expiry date is before the end of 2020, or if the start date is on or after January 1st of 2020, or if the end date does not equal March 31st of 2019. Just one more thing about the logic of these entity rules. Individual entities can be checked for multiple criteria by use of conjunction operators and or. The AND operator will perform a logical conjunction on two statements. It only yields a value of true when both statements are true. If one of the two statements is false, it's going to yield a false value. The OR operator will also perform a logical conjunction on two statements, but it yields a value of true when either one or both statements are true. If both the statements are false, then of course it will yield a false value. Here are just a couple of examples. So maybe the effective date needs to be after January 1st of 88, but before January 1st of 1990. Then you can see the following example is essentially the same rules, but with an OR. So it's going to be risk if it's one or the other. And then the third example is a rule that actually spans across two lines because it doesn't have to just be limited to two rules. It could be multiple. So if the jurisdiction is California or Maryland or New York or Florida and so on and so forth. This is why it is important to surround your rules with parentheses, though, to clearly distinguish between the multiple criteria. Also, just be aware that you cannot configure both and or operators in one condition. So it has to either be and or. It can't be an and an or. Now, with all of that said, I know it's pretty conceptual, and I'm sure it still feels a bit unfamiliar. So let's just go into our existing risk configuration, expand some intents, and explore the out-of-the-box enabled entities. Then we'll be sure to identify one of each type of the entity rules so you can see how those rules are written. And then we'll save and or edit at least one condition for some of those entity rules. We can be more specific with our configuration by enabling some entities to analyze and then decide high, medium, and low risks. So let's start writing some rules, and along the way we'll explore some of the existing out-of-box enabled entities just to see the different rule types and how they're written. Let's start with the business category in the term intent, and I'm actually going to enable this again just so we can see it, and this will turn to a green check once we save. So you can see that there are three entities that fall underneath term. We have duration, effective date, and expiry date. Each of them has the ability to set its own level of risk, and that is in addition to any variance of language flagging this risk severity at the intent level. Let me just show you an example of a date rule type. Maybe we want to write an entity rule for effective date. The way that we write the rule, remember we have to put the whole thing in parentheses, and then we write the name of the entity exactly as it appears above. Then decide our conditional operator. I'm going to say if the effective date is after, so you can see I have this greater than symbol, is after, and then I'm going to write a date in single quotes. 01/01 of 25, close the quote, close the parenthesis. Then we're going to mark this as medium risk. So what that's saying is that if we're analyzing a contract that's not supposed to start for another 4 or 5 years, we want to take a closer look at that. So this would be an example of the date entity rule type. We've got our parentheses, the name of the entity right here, if it's after January 1st of 2025, and that date is in single quotes. Let's look at another example. I'll expand the commercial category and let's look at payment terms. There's a couple of good ones here that come out of the box for us. So by default, when we create this configuration, the interest entity and payment term entity are enabled. And you can see that those are written here as the number entity rule type. So the way that it's written right now, it says if the interest is greater than 1, it's going to flag as medium risk. I could change that and say high risk if I wanted to. And I also could change the conditional operator or anything else about this entity rule. In our case, I kind of like that it's 1, but maybe instead of being greater than 1, I could just change the rule just for example's sake to be not equal to 1. And remember, we write not equal as exclamation point equal sign. So if the interest is not 1, it's going to be high risk. For payment term, the default coming out of the box is that if it's less than 30 days, that should indicate medium risk. We'll leave the medium risk as it is, but maybe I'll change this to if it's less than or equal to 45 days. So those are a couple of examples of the number entity rule type. Now let's look at legal, force majeure. Remember that in our last demonstration, I copied and pasted our standard language here. You can see that the duration coming out of the box is less than 100 days, indicates high risk. We could change that if we want to, or we could leave it alone. Remember too that we can disable entities just like we could disable intents. So maybe I don't need this notices entity included in our risk analysis. I can just deselect the enabled box. What I'm going to do in this example is something that you may be considering as you analyze your contracts moving forward. Maybe we now want to make sure that our contracts have the word pandemic included in the clause, so we can set an associated risk if that is not included. So I'm going to write a rule that is text actual entity rule type. And the way that I would write this is parentheses and then the name of the intent, so causes. In this case, I'm going to say, if we do not see the word pandemic, so that's if we don't see it, so exclamation point equal sign, and then in single quotes, the word that we're looking for, close the single quotes, close the parentheses. So if we do not see the word pandemic, we want to make sure to flag that as maybe medium risk. Take a closer look and see if there's another word like epidemic or something that still would meet the criteria of another situation like COVID-19 occurring. So this is an example of text actual. It's going to look for a specific word or phrase in this intent. And if it, in my case today, does not see it because we wrote it as does not equal, then it will flag it as risk. And similarly, you could write a text actual rule as indicating risk if it does include a certain word. We'll just leave it as this for right now. Now let's look at the law and jurisdiction intent. You can see I have a couple of enabled entities below, jurisdiction and law. Now I want to point out the jurisdiction entity because this is a good example of where we can see the or conjunction operator at work here. So we can see that if the jurisdiction in the contract is California or Maryland or New York or Florida or Washington, going on and on and on, it's going to be marked as medium risk. Maybe I'll change that to low risk. And I could change these too. These are just coming out of the box. I'm going to leave them alone for this example. What I really want to point out is an example of the text calculated entity rule type. That's demonstrated out of the box with this law entity. So you can see here that it says law does not equal yes. Now remember, for text calculated, it's either going to be equals yes or does not equal yes. There's no equals no. What you're saying by enabling this entity with the text calculated entity rule is that you want the system to look for language that it's already trained to look for pertaining to this intent. The way this rule is written, the system will basically mark the document as risky, it says high risk here, if there is no language in the intent that it knows behind the scenes or has been trained to recognize as related to this law entity. Another example might be in indemnification. Right out of the box, we can see that the responsibility entity is enabled and its responsibility equals yes. So the system is already trained by artificial intelligence to look for words like replace, modify, refund, things pertaining to responsibility. If it finds those words in the intent, it will mark it as medium because this rule is written as equals yes. So yes, there are words or phrases that pertain to responsibility, then it's going to mark it as medium risk. So those are just a couple of examples of the text calculated entity rules. So obviously you can see there are lots of different options for configuring entity rules. My presentation and this demonstration are only highlighting a few of them, but you can always find out more in the Contracts Plus handbook. It's also found in the In Context help right on this page. If you need help writing entity rules or with anything pertaining to risk configurations, click this question mark icon at the top. That's going to open up the online searchable help here. You can see that it's organized into categories, like if you want to edit your risk configuration, if you want to delete the draft, intent categories, and actually what I want to look at is the entities section. So this is where it will help you figure out how to write an entity rule, talk about the 4 types, and give some examples, along with some additional information. So don't feel like you have to memorize the exact formatting or understand the ins and outs of this feature just from watching this video. Be sure to use the resources that you have, including the Contracts Plus handbook and this online help if you ever get stuck. For right now, let's save our changes. And for the purposes of our demonstration, let's talk next about how we can finalize and activate this risk configuration so that we can start using it on our contracts. This lesson is called Activating a Risk Configuration. We will learn how to assign a contract type to the configuration, activate the configuration, and also how to create a new draft configuration in the future. Before we can use our risk configuration, we need to assign it to at least one contract type so that it can be used when creating contracts of that type in Contracts Plus. You can do this from the page that lists the configurations by selecting Edit Properties. I'll show you where and how to do this in just a moment. The overlay that appears there will allow you to associate this configuration with one or more contract types. There are a few things to note here. Each configuration can be used with multiple contract types to analyze contracts. So you can see in my screenshot here that I could use this configuration for both MSAs and service agreements in my organization. However, each contract type can only use one configuration, meaning that, as an example, since MSAs would now be tied to this specific configuration, they cannot also be associated to a different configuration. So just to clarify, the configuration can be used with multiple contract types, but each contract type can only use one configuration. The contract type association setting is also a setting that can be changed after the configuration is activated. So if you ever need to make a change here, that's totally fine. You can come in and edit the contract types. Activating a configuration is easy when the time comes. When you're viewing the configuration, you can finalize and activate the draft right from the Actions drop-down menu at the top of the page. If you're viewing that list of configurations, you can select this from the Actions drop-down next to the configuration that you want to activate. Once active, then your users can run the risk analysis on contracts of the designated type associated with this configuration. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure to mention how to create a new draft configuration, since it's likely that you will need to make changes to your existing terms and conditions at some point. If, instead of creating a brand new configuration, you want to just edit or expand upon an existing and active one, you can click Create Draft. When you do that, you'll have the option to copy the existing active configuration or not. If you select yes, then it will copy what you have so far, and you can just tweak it or make changes to what you already have. If you select no, then it would be like starting from scratch and it will pull the out-of-the-box model. Whenever you finalize and activate this new draft, a prompt will ask you just to confirm that you want to override the existing active configuration and replace it with this one. Let's go back to our risk configuration. Observe how to finalize and activate it while we're viewing the configuration, but then we're going to go back to the Risk Management Configuration List page and assign a couple of contract types that will use this configuration before we finalize and activate from there. Then at the very end of the demonstration, I'll just initiate the creation of a draft so you can see how to do that. So let's go into Contracts Plus and take a look. Now that we've saved our changes, we can finalize and activate our risk configuration. if we feel like it's ready to go. While I'm viewing the risk configuration, I could do it right here from the Actions dropdown. I could finalize and activate this draft, or I could delete the draft. Be aware that you cannot delete a configuration once it's been finalized and activated. You can only delete it if it's in a draft. I don't want to actually activate just yet though, because we need to associate contract types to this configuration first. So let's go back to Manage Configurations. Here's my list. We can see this is the one that we've been working on, MSA 2021. It does not have an active version, and we could still edit the draft. To associate a contract type, let's go to Actions, Edit Properties, and this is where we can do it. So we see this contract types, type ahead box here. We could search if we weren't sure what our options were by using the magnifying glass. I'm going to associate this with Master Service Agreements. Remember that we can assign this to multiple contract types if we'd like. Maybe I'll do Master Service Agreements and Service Agreements and save. And those are listed here. 2 contract types selected. You can click that hyperlink to view the 2 that are associated with it. Now, before I finalize and activate this, I just want to point out that if we were to try to assign service agreements, for example, to a different configuration, we'll edit the properties, we'll select service agreements. It is able to be selected. It's just that when we save, I'm going to get a message here that's asking me to confirm that we want to reassign it to a different configuration. For a demonstration, I'll do that. And so now you can see service agreements is associated with our regular MSA, whereas the MSA is associated with the new configuration. So just be aware of that. Each contract type can only use one configuration, though each configuration could be associated with multiple contract types. Now let's finalize and activate from this Actions dropdown. Finalize and activate draft. Now you can see we've got an active configuration that we can view. And since it's active, contracts that are the Master Service Agreement type can now use this configuration to analyze risk. It's now ready to go and be used like we saw in the first lesson in this class. Now just one final thing. If you want to create a new draft of an active configuration, you can click the Create Draft button. This is where you can choose whether you want to copy the existing one or not. In most cases, you would probably say yes, otherwise you would just create a new one. We'll click Create, and that creates a draft for us where we can continue editing and saving our changes. The changes that you make here will not be applied to contract risk analysis until you activate this draft. So you can continue to work in here and only activate it once you're ready to see those changes take place. And that concludes our demonstration on how to create and manage risk configurations. Let's take a moment for a quick review. Hopefully by now, you feel like you could answer our essential questions that we posed at the beginning of this class. As far as the ways that this could be useful in your organization, some of the benefits include risk exposure, third-party contract language analysis, and ultimately time savings. End users can quickly perform risk analysis on contracts by just selecting the Analyze Contract action when viewing a contract main document, and that will quickly run the risk report. In terms of what is entailed for the setup of these risk configurations, we walked through that process and discussed the enablement of intents, the inclusion of standard language, and the creation of entity rules with associated risk severity. Thank you very much for watching.